listener production.
Hey, Sasha Barbagat with you. Welcome to The Briefing. For the meat lovers among us, nothing tickles the palate quite like a bacon and egg roll or maybe a juicy sausage sizzle fresh off the barbie. I'm hungry just thinking about it. Processed meats are a huge part of our diet and a lot of them are bloody delicious. But more and more, we're being told how bad they are for us with potential links to bowel cancer. And as we see more young people being diagnosed with the disease, experts are pushing for changes to the $4 billion industry.
About 5 Australians a day getting diagnosed because of processed meats. It's very alarming, very disturbing, but this is a food scare that came 10 years ago with the World Health Organization. They declared them a class 1 carcinogen alongside asbestos, radiation, tobacco.
So is anything being done about the health fears around processed meats? That's coming up in the second half of this episode. First, it is time for the headlines, as always, with Chris Spiru on Thursday, March 13.
Morning, Sash. Morning, everybody. And before we get into headline one, I'd like to hear from no other than Afro Man.
Because I got high, because I got high, because I got high.
What a fitting way to introduce this story. The Greens will renew their push to get weed legalised in Australia during the next parliament. The party will today unveil new budget estimates that suggest making the drug legal could add $700 million to the economy, a figure that's much lower than what they predicted in 2023. At the time, the bill claimed that letting adults use marijuana recreationally would generate almost $3 billion a year for Aussie coffers, but that figure was criticised at the time and the legislation was voted down by Labor and the Coalition last year. So what's different this time? Well, not a lot. The party's leader, Adam Bandt, says the Greens back adults being able to make their own decisions about their use of cannabis, and the party will once again campaign on the issue. He says users would be able to go to, quote, chilled out spaces like cafes and dispensaries to buy the drug.
So right now, to give a picture of, where the drug's at in Australia, medicinal marijuana is legal in all states and territories, but it is heavily regulated. Now, the recreational use of weed is illegal everywhere, except in the ACT, where it has been decriminalised rather than legalised. So basically that means people aren't thrown into jail or fined for personal use, but, if you've got cartels or, bigger organisations running the drug, that's a different story. That's still illegal. Now, the next question is, I guess, for people who might be excited by the idea of this, is where do the major parties stand on it? Because remember, the Greens love to come out with these big policies, but so rarely do we see them have genuine success in Parliament to get them through. Look, unsurprisingly, the Coalition's position remains unchanged. It is against legalising marijuana. Labor has kind of said it's a matter for the states and territories, it's not for us. But that has been disputed because the Greens' plan would require the collection of tax, which makes it a federal issue. So Labor doesn't want to get into this before the election. I think Anthony Albanese is probably feeling very risk averse with a lot of stuff, and something like legalising weed, while I'm sure a lot of people are like, yeah, just do it. It would get a lot of negative attention from people who are worried about what the drug's impacts could be on society. But the Greens say, it'll take 60,000 people out of the criminal justice system, which is obviously completely under strain at the moment. And it'll also create long-running sustainable jobs in the legal cannabis industry. So they think the boost to the economy would be worth it, aside from the fact that people just might want to smoke weed.
And I think it is worth noting that historically opposition to this being legalised is that floodgates argument that, if you legalise marijuana, then down the track we're going to have to legalise all the other more, traditionally harder drugs, so things like coke, MDMA and things like that. I think what the Globe has shown us and where this has worked is that legalising marijuana can be its own standalone issue without opening those floodgates. It doesn't have to open the door to more drugs coming through. And I think the conversation is shifting. To your point, and I totally agree with you, I really do not think that this will come into effect anytime soon. You're right. Anthony Albanese is going to want to lay low on these sort of controversial issues, even though it might win him, a significant portion of younger voters. And, older voters too. I
know plenty of older weed smokers.
The The world is teetering on the edge of an all-out trade war today as Donald Trump continues to inflict his tariffs on economies around the globe. A reminder, we got confirmation yesterday that Australia would not be exempt from a 25% tax on its steel and aluminium exports to the US, but Foreign Minister Penny Wong last night confirmed on the ABC that negotiations aren't over yet.
There's always more advocacy, there's always more negotiation and putting of the Australian case. That is what we will continue to do. That's what we have been doing.
Oh, I admire her determination there, but I just don't see this becoming, any different over the coming days. Hey, sticking with this though, the European Union has announced its own retaliatory measures against the United States and will impose duties or taxes on $45 billion worth of American goods. That will include not just steel and aluminium products, but also textiles, home appliances, and agricultural goods, and things like motorcycles, bourbon, peanut butter, and jeans, which I feel like is a very targeted approach here.
Well, interestingly, the whiskey market in the US exports huge amounts of its whiskey to Europe, so that would be a big blow for US manufacturers. Look, Canada as well has announced further retaliatory tariffs on more than $30 billion worth of imports from the US, also going further than steel and aluminium to include computers, sports equipment, and cast iron products. All of this is over the same tariff problem that Australia is facing, which is that tax of 25% on all steel and aluminium imports into the US. And a reminder, we did, or if you haven't seen it yet, we did do a deep dive with Malcolm Turnbull yesterday afternoon. In the feed now, really great listen. He spoke a lot about this tariffs issue. I guess the next thing, and this is something that Turnbull touched on as well, was, the appetite among Australians for harsher or stronger rhetoric against Donald Trump, because I think now that Australia is being directly impacted by Donald Trump's policies, up until now, we're a member of the global community, and I think some people would say, well, who cares? Other people would say, well, we have a responsibility as members of the global community to call things out if they're wrong. But Anthony Albanese said, we're not going to have a running commentary on everything Trump does. Now that it's impacting Australia, people have a bigger appetite for that. And interestingly, we heard our strongest words from Albanese yesterday. He said the president has breached the spirit of Australia's friendship with the US. Peter Dutton, meantime, who also has been kind of shy to criticise Donald Trump for whatever reason, he says he'd get the tariffs wiped if he was in office. So he's coming out and saying, vote for me and I'm going to stand up to Trump for you, which is an interesting position from the opposition leader. And he's, of course, criticised Labor for being weak on the issue and failing to get this carve out for Australia. Yeah,
and that's something that Malcolm Turnbull did speak about yesterday in that deep dive. Definitely, again, worth a listen. It's just politicising this issue in that way is not helpful in the slightest, because the way that these exemptions are structured is that they're blanket. No one's getting out of this. Not Australia, no other allies getting out of this. So to sit there and say that different leadership or different tactics could or may have worked is just... I don't want to go as far to say a lie, but I think it's a lie.
It's far-fetched.
It's a lie. It's far-fetched. That's much better language. And hey, just a really quick update on the ceasefire deal between Ukraine and Russia. Donald Trump this morning has provided an update on that. He says that US officials are on the way to Russia now to discuss the plan, which Ukraine has already agreed to, and that's that immediate 30-day ceasefire.
The rate of First Nations people being jailed has increased by 20% since 2019, and that's according to new data from Closing the Gap. In number terms, it means for every 100,000 prisoners in Australia, around 2,300 are Indigenous, and that is up from 1,900 in 2019, so not an insignificant jump. The rise comes despite state, territory and federal governments all agreeing to reduce the rates of Indigenous carceration by 15% by 2031. This data, which also reveals a 3% rise in First Nations children in out-of-home care in the last 5 years and record high rates of suicide, has prompted calls from Indigenous organisations for greater action.
A reminder, the National Agreement on Closing the Gap has 19 socio-economic targets to improve life outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Among them are health, education, employment, improved access to information and culture. While internet access and native title gains have improved, advocacy groups are warning tough on crime approaches in some Australian jurisdictions are having negative impacts. Overall, the data shows 4 targets are on track to be met, 6 targets have shown some improvement, while 4 are actually worsening. And that tough on crime approach is something that is bubbling away nationally and internationally. It seems there's a big appetite for lawmakers to, be heavy-handed when it comes to crime, especially youth crime. And when it comes to Indigenous affairs, and where this becomes problematic is that is a very rigid and black and white approach. And when it comes to this, we need nuance. We need something that goes to the root causes. And that's what a lot of experts say. While tougher punishments are something that people are campaigning on, it's important to note that that's just one factor when it comes to combating and treating crime. We have 2 other major goals of the Australian judicial system, and that's rehabilitation and reformation. So when you're throwing people in jails and chucking fines at them that disproportionately affect people, you're not really helping the issue in the slightest. And when it comes to meaningful change, especially for First Nations people, there has to be some sort of intersection with cultural leaders and people who understand what it's like to be Indigenous.
And changing pace now, we have caught the attention of Leonardo DiCaprio for all the wrong reasons once again.
You're so stupid. Why'd you do that, huh? You're so stupid, Rose. Why did you do that? Why?
Sorry, that's one of my favourite movies. That scene came to my head when we were putting this story together. We had to get it in. I should clarify as well, we mean Australia, not the briefing. The Hollywood star has come out to criticise the government for approving the expansion of a mine in WA that would clear nearly 4,000 hectares of native vegetation. Now, he took to Instagram. He has nearly 80 million followers there. And he wrote this long statement about, native forest logging being banned in Western Australia in 2024 and the fact that the clearance of native forests for mining is still happening due to separate government policies that prioritise mining development over environmental protection. So a big public slapdown of the WA government from Leonardo DiCaprio.
Yeah, and this all stems from a decision made last month where Environment Minister Tanya Plibersek greenlit the request by South 32, which would impact the northern Jarrah forest in the state's southwest. The mining and metals company at the time said it needed the expansion to sustain the state's supply of aluminium, which it described as critical to global energy. And this is not the first time the Hollywood star has hit out at our government, is it, Sash?
No, he really likes to publicly shame Australia for some of its awful environmental policies, let's be real. He has hit out at the Tassie government before for its native forest logging. That was last year, actually. I remember reporting on it at the time. He's also talked about deforestation in Queensland and the cattle industry. And even as far back as 2014, he criticised the then Abbott government for failing to adequately protect the Great Barrier Reef.
Yeah, and it's not off-brand for him in the slightest. We know he's heavily involved in environmental activism. He's a founding board member of conservation group Rewild. So this is very much on brand for him. It's just always funny when you see a big international star having beef with Australia, because I just feel like we're in the little tiny corner. I know we're a big country, but I just feel like I don't know. I feel like we never get a look in when it comes to things like this.
No, we're so I feel like in Australia we feel so unimportant, and Hollywood feels so big and far away that if Hollywood's talking about us, don't you get excited when you hear Australia in a movie? You're like, oh, that's where I live.
Except for when they butcher our accents, I will say that. Yeah, that's a real bugaboo of mine.
Bluey's doing great work on the global stage to advance Australia, so we stand Bluey. Okay, that's enough. Thank you, Chris. Next up, we are getting into what could be considered an environmental issue, but it's definitely a health one, and that's processed meats and how it's affecting our health and whether anything's being done about it.
Hey, it's Helen Smith here with this episode of The Briefing. Australians love meat. Whether it's a meat pie at the footy, a democracy sausage at your local election, or a high-protein diet. In fact, we consume close to 17 kilograms of processed meat every year on average. Now, you might remember back in 2015, the World Health Organization declared that eating processed meat can lead to bowel cancer, and it was classified as a Group 1 carcinogen.
It was a sobering day for meat lovers.
Sausage, bacon, ham, and hot dogs
Oh, bacon.
can cause certain types of cancer.
No!
An expert panel under the World Health Organization looked at more than 800 studies and classified processed meat as carcinogenic.
Processed meats can cause cancer.
This news was met with a lot of backlash, including Barnaby Joyce, who at the time was the Agriculture Minister, saying, if you got everything the World Health Organization says is carcinogenic and took it out of your daily requirements, you're heading back to a cave. But since then, our diets have been getting worse, and just last year we saw 300 more fast food stores popping up around Australia. But how do you combat a $4 billion industry? Lucy Morris-Marr is an investigative journalist and author of Processed, How the Processed Meat Industry is Killing Us with the Food We Love. At 44 years old, Lucy was diagnosed with stage 4 bowel cancer, and she's not alone. We've seen a rise of more young adults getting cancer across the globe, with experts arguing processed meats could be a contributing factor. Lucy, is processed meat really killing us?
Absolutely. During the lengthy research of this book over 4 years, I was absolutely stunned by what I uncovered. I read hundreds of clinical reports and studies. A really alarming figure came from the UK, the Cancer Council there, and they actually managed to narrow down that 13% of all their bowel cancer cases, which in the UK is 44,000 a year, with over 8,000 deaths, 16,000 deaths, each year, they narrowed down that 13% was due to processed meats. If you equate that to Australia, I worked out that was about 5 Australians a day getting diagnosed because of processed meats. It's very alarming, very disturbing. But this is a food scare that came 10 years ago with the World Health Organization when they declared that processed meats, and these are the cured ones, the tasty ones, the hot dogs, the pepperoni, the salamis, the ones everyone loves, the smoked ones, they declared them a class 1 carcinogen alongside asbestos, radiation, tobacco. Now, they weren't saying they were equally as bad, but they were in that class 1 category and declared them a carcinogen. So, yes, it's very alarming, but there was lots of media at the time, but then nothing was done. So I decided to write a book because this is a food scare that's really disturbing, but it's been ignored to suit the industry, really. I just want to amplify it.
Yeah, as you said, this narrative and this information has been around for a while. Why now? Why right now? What's been a force of you putting this book out?
Well, in late 2019, I was unfortunately diagnosed with stage 4 bowel cancer. And obviously, as a journalist, I made a deep dive and thought, oh my goodness, what causes this? I was only 44 at the time, and I was very fit and well. I loved healthy food. I thought I was pretty healthy. I was exercising. My first book had just come out and I was doing festivals and speeches and things. I was flying high and I was struck down by this. Effectively, it felt like a terminal diagnosis. I mean, it was absolutely horrendous. And then when I started researching, processed meats just kept coming into the frame as a possible suspect. Look, I'll never know if my own cancer was sparked by processed meats, but they're in the frame. I'll never know. No one can ever be certain, I suppose. But they definitely, I started to think, I didn't eat them. And then I thought about the Bunnings sausage sometimes, and then the bacon in the soups. I thought, well, I never ate the plastic ham that my husband tended to like in a white roll with chips and things. But then I thought, oh my gosh, at Christmas, that was my forte, the Christmas ham with the cloves, with the sugar and the red wine. And then I really thought, it was in my diet, and my heart sank. And like I said, I didn't know for certain, but I thought, hang on, I'm not seeing any public warnings. I'm not seeing, labeling. And I felt quite angry and disturbed. And I spoke to my friends, and none of them seemed aware of this link. And it wasn't just bowel cancer. They said at the time stomach cancer. But then when I read all these clinical studies over a number of years, I found 10 conditions in total that processed meats were linked to. Dementia was one, which has actually made the news recently with another study. New studies are coming out all the time. So, yeah, it was really, really frightening what I uncovered.
You previously acknowledged financial experts around the globe have said that bad publicity around processed meats is unlikely to affect the market and investor confidence. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, it was interesting when the World Health Organization made that statement in 2015, but they were all very, very defensive. But of course, they're doing masses of marketing, every day. I mean, you see them on buses about these, the packs which have the crackers, the cheese and the salami for the lunch boxes. There's targeted marketing everywhere. And of course, I just don't think the public messaging was strong enough to reach the consumer in a mass way. Some people are vaguely aware, I find, the people I speak to, but some really weren't. And these are parents, because of course there are lots of other things they're worrying about as well. Other health issues, other foods, sugar, fizzy drinks, fast foods. And so there is a lot for people to be aware of. But this is one that, because it's so endemic in the everyday, that's what really drove me to look at it.
I feel like the narrative we're seeing is also protein and meat. You need to eat all this meat to get all this protein, and high protein diets have become such a huge trend, especially in young people, putting protein in everything, including water even sometimes. Are these diets and products also part of the problem?
Yes, because there is this huge trend. And I've got a son who's 16 and a half and loves the gym. And he keeps saying, I need chicken for breakfast, lunch and dinner. And I keep saying, you can have chickpeas. You can have so many other things, we can make for you, that are interesting and tasty. And it doesn't have to be, that's not the only source. Like Greek yogurt has protein, cheeses, so many other things. But yeah, there is this huge trend, and it's quite worrying because I don't think the body, and of course, because with protein comes saturated fat. And if you have too much protein, especially with these carnivore diets, which are also quite trendy, where's the fiber? What's it doing to the colon? But yes, there's a huge campaign by gyms and food manufacturers now for protein yogurts, protein meals. They sell them, don't they? Those gym type of meals that are targeted particularly at men and young men. Young women, I suppose, as well. But particularly men, it seems, under a lot of pressure, almost like peer pressure to eat this high protein food. But yes, it is worrying because if they're turning towards bacons and sausages as well in terms of high protein meats, and pepperoni and beef jerky is something else my son seemed interested in. And I had to point out that it had one of the preservatives, which I really drilled down on in my book, which is sodium nitrate, preservative 250. And I said, even a lot of the beef jerkies are in that. They're certainly in nearly all hams, all of those things that I'm worried about. And so it's a bit scary if they're then turning and eating them in abundance. It's really quite frightening in some ways because it's a really unbalanced, faddy way of eating, and we don't yet know the long-term consequences of this.
Is the government doing anything about this at the moment? And we mentioned before, more information is unlikely to dent profitability. How do you think this can change?
Well, I personally would love to see, as the EU recently in the last 18 months have forced meat companies to reduce the amount of sodium nitrate they're using. There's quite a good lobby group in France of MPs and scientists who've worked for quite some time, and that was quite effective. That isn't happening here. I seem to be a bit of a lone voice at the moment. I'm hoping others will join me. I mean, I've certainly had, since my book came out, a great reaction from the public and nutritionists, but I really would like government figures to try and get behind this as well. To reduce or even ban sodium nitrate would be my dream. And then just really a public health campaign, from the government. Nearly all of the main cancer charities, including Bowel Cancer Australia and the Cancer Council, where you go into sort of risk factors and then sometimes advise about diets, they all say eliminate or reduce massively your processed meats and red meats as well. Often their audience are people who are dealing with cancer or their carers, etc. And so what we need is prevention before that step is needed. Yeah. And so that's where, the labeling and the campaigning and a public message campaigning would be my ideal. And then obviously a reduction in those nitrates in the food manufacturing area. But look, it's a big business. It's in Australia, the processed meats, it's a $4 billion business with 10,000 jobs. And they also export meats as well. So it's a hugely profitable business, and it's all about the bottom line. It's all about sales. There's middle managers. And what I discovered as well in the book was the main companies here, the big players such as Primo and Don, etc. They're owned mostly by massive overseas conglomerates who own multiple areas of the food sectors, not just meat, all over the world. For example, Primo is owned by JBS in Brazil, and they own half the world's meat industry and companies. And so are those people at the top of that tree really thinking about the toddler in Australia with a Twiggy stick in their lunchbox that has sodium nitrate in it? They're overseas. They own so many, they might not even remember what they own. I mean, it's at that level because they own other things as well, and in multiple countries. So I really push to friends and parents and say, check the labels. No one cares more than you. And I wrote to Woolworths, I wrote to Coles, I wrote to Aldi, and they didn't want to engage. They just said, we're following food regulations, which they are. They're probably using the exact amount of sodium nitrate. Processed meats are allowed, but they didn't want to engage with me in a conversation. It was a very strange silence that I met. And I contacted those overseas companies and their top executives and CEOs as well, just to knock on their doors, because that's what journalists do, isn't it? We knock on doors where for other people. And that was quite satisfying, because I thought, well, at least I made my points. But it was a strange silence. And you can tell it's an Achilles heel of this meat industry, the processed meats, and especially the use of sodium nitrate.
Yeah, and last year we did see around 300 new fast food stores popping up around Australia, and processed meat is at the heart of a lot of those fast food stores, and majority of them are partnered up with delivery services like Uber Eats and Deliveroo. The accessibility to these foods, just to order them at the tip of your finger, is so easy. Is that also something that we need more education around?
Yes, totally. And another thing about these fast food companies is they're mostly employing teenagers as soon as they turn, 14 and a half, 15, whatever the legal point is, and they're paid very poorly. But, these teenagers, of course, it's nice to earn some money. But then I've noticed when my son did briefly work for a company, a fast food company, they got massive discounts of 50%. And some of the fast foods are giving them a free meal around their shift, either beginning or the end, or massive discounts. They can also apply certain discounts to any friends who come along. So, of course, they're not only employing them en masse in Australia, they're also getting new customers from it. And like you said, it's cheap to deliver as well. And I did really look closely at Subway, McDonald's and Domino's, and they were using cheap meats with the sodium nitrate. I found the ingredients on their websites, or I asked for them. And so that's in the mix as well. And what's scary, of course, is if they're not eating homemade food, if they're not eating nutritious food, they're eating this high fat, high salt, high sugar, high refined carbohydrates, which of course leads to obesity, diabetes, heart disease. Also, for young people, you're setting yourself up this dietary pattern for life. And it's really, really sad and upsetting, isn't it? And also they're losing those skills of cooking. And often it's so simple and cheaper in many ways if they knew how to do it. And so it's also teaching our younger generation how to cook, how to make things that are really delicious and simple and often cheaper. But of course, again, they're getting this marketing as well, aiming at these teenagers. And it's really hard for them to resist.
What do you want with this research and your book? What do you want someone to get out of it? Is it for them to stop eating processed meat?
As I said, it's their bodies, their rules, and I say that in the book. I think once they read my book, it will put them off. I have noticed that so far. I make so many arguments on so many levels. But, again, that's up to them. And what I do say is, I give tips on ways to wean off it, whether you can make it more of a treat and then find the highest quality bacon, which doesn't have chemical nitrates. And you can find that. There's one brand in Woolworths. There's some in the more smaller delis, or you can even order it online if you really like to. Is making those choices just to reduce your risk. And then, of course, if you're out and you're at brunch and you think, I'd love some bacon, something salty next to my eggs and tomatoes and everything, you could, of course, think about halloumi, falafel, other things I've mentioned, mushrooms cooked in like really lovely herbs and salt and pepper and things, can be just that lovely bitey, juicy thing that sometimes you want with the eggs. That can replace bacon really well. So it's just like making those small changes. But I think it's also be very careful and please read labels. I don't know if people are aware and know what things mean, and just really advocate for your own health, because you're the one that cares the most. The food industry and the supermarkets don't care about your health. You have to be really strong and make those decisions, and that's what I wanted to come across.
Lucy, thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing.
My pleasure. Thanks so much.
That was Lucy Morris-Martha, investigative journalist, and you can grab a copy of her book, Processed, How the Processed Meat Industry is Killing Us with the Food We Love, at any good bookstore, and I've also popped the link in our show notes as well. And just an update, since Lucy's diagnosis, she's undergone a successful liver transplant, becoming the first patient in a Victorian hospital to have that as a bowel cancer patient, and only the third in Australia. And you can find out more about that in her book, Processed, as well. But that's it for this episode of The Briefing. Thanks for listening. Before you go, though, we'd love it if you could share this ep with someone else you think might enjoy it as well. It really does help us keep doing what we do here at The Briefing. And you can check us out on socials as well, at The Briefing Podcast on Instagram and on TikTok and YouTube. Just search for Listener Newsroom. I'm Helen Smith. See you next time.
Listener.